Hi guys, I'm back with the second part of my 50NL Zoom review, and we're just going to be picking up from where we left off. Really, I'm sure. Well, we probably don't actually, but I certainly remember this hand popping up towards the end. I think we finished at 15:02, so there's just going to be a couple of seconds overlap. But hopefully some interesting spots pick up. This is going to be something of a different style to the first video. Now, I can't actually remember playing this session at this stage, so we're going to have a slightly different focus where instead of reviewing based on my thoughts at the time, which I think certainly has its merits. I think it gets a more realistic, it gives you a more realistic view of the thought process in game. Here we're going to be reviewing essentially assessing the quality of various lines more objectively, I think. Okay, so without further ado, let's get on with it. Okay, here are fish 3 bets. I think the only real option here is going to be cold 4 betting. Fish often have pretty wide 3 betting ranges, so we're not too downhearted about getting it in, especially considering we might often get it in against ace queen or ace jack, and also we usually get to isolate the fish here if middle position jams. Then we will be in a tough spot, but it will probably be a situation where we can strongly consider folding. We also have the benefit here that if we are playing a fish with a very value-heavy range for a fish 3-bet range, we do have the ace and king blockers, so we do cut the number of ace and kings combos they can have in half. Yeah, regarding the bottom right hand table, sometimes my HUD just might stop working. I don't know why that is. It's just been happening lately for a hand or two. So I think this bottom right table situation, this is quite an interesting spot to illustrate the difference in the way you ought to be playing against fish and against regs. So again, against regs, I think this hand is often going to be best just to check back, for a number of reasons. Firstly, we can't really value bet and we can't really bluff it, which is going to be the case with most of our 7x. Secondly, and this is the more important point I feel regarding playing the hand against regs, it's going to be quite nice to have some flush draws in our range for checking back the flop. Otherwise, our range becomes really capped on flushing runouts, which means that our opponent can overbet pretty effectively. Now, I'm not saying in fact I'm really unsure that I would expect a 50NL always even regs to realise that we are capped in this situation when we check back the flop and a flush card comes on the turn, or B, them to be able to exploit it. But it's certainly nice to be aware of it, so you can start implementing it into your game for perhaps against a better regs at 50 zoom, or when you start looking to 100 zoom. Still only the better regs there, admittedly, but you can never go too far wrong, because I don't think against a reg, betting is going to be hugely more plus EV than checking here. Against the fish, on the other hand, I think there's absolutely no need to consider protecting ranges, etc. What we want to do is essentially bet our equity here. We're almost certainly going to be ahead of his calling range, significantly so. I think we're actually marginally ahead of a hand like ace-4 with no spade here. which means that considering that's going to be one of the better hands in his calling range, this is probably quite a clear value bet against the fish. And in general, against fish, you should be much more inclined to bet your equity and less inclined to check to protect a range. Well, I say less inclined. In fact, you should very rarely, if at all, be checking to protect a range. Just before continuing, I want to quickly discuss this situation on the top right-hand table, table 2. 55-17 guy min raises under the gun. We're assuming he's pretty bad. So we're just going to be free betting most of our continuance range here. To isolate, we're going to, especially hands like this, are going to play much better heads up against the weaker player than they would do in multi-way pots. I think while never calling is certainly a legitimate strategy for this reason. If you do have a calling range, it's going to be very tight and well defined. I'm not sure that really matters. I don't expect most regs to be capable of exploiting that, especially with the fish in the pot. It's tough to be particularly concerned about exploiting another reg anyway. But also, A, they have to realise that under the gun is a fish. B, they have to realise the strategic adjustments we're making, and C, they have to know how to exploit that. And I'm not certain that any of those three factors are going to be the case for your average 15-hour Zoom reg. With King Jack here, I think it's pretty close between whether it's bet or check. Certainly, this is a flop which hits our opponent's range very hard. They're not going to want to fold often at all, especially considering we're probably going to assume that they're not going to want to fold a 9. So if we bet, we're probably looking to fold out pocket 8s through pocket 2s. And I suppose that's the reason I prefer a check. Simply because if we want to realise any fold equity here against this weaker player, we're probably going to have to be starting to barrel multiple streets. And considering the likely weight of ace-x hands in our opponent's pre-flop range, and their likely propensity to never fold an ace-x hand. I'm not sure that's phrased in a weird way, but you get what I mean. It's a situation where we probably don't want to be going crazy with the double and triple barrels. Although this is certainly a hand which is one which we might want to strongly consider double and triple barreling, because it turns a lot more equity on a 7, 8, or hearts. Obviously it hits a straight on a queen, and well, that's essentially it. But it's got relatively good barreling opportunities. But with that said, I still don't think that the argument's strong enough to start c-betting this hand. Good. There's also the advantage that we gain a lot more information about our opponent's range by their turn play. I expect we're often going to see people, especially weaker players, play this turn in a fairly straight-up manner, so they're probably going to bet an ace or better and check everything else. At which point we might be able to start bluffing, though it's still pretty close given the strength of their pre-flop range on this board. So here we've had our cold 4-bet called, and our opponent checks a low flop. I'm pretty happy with checking back here. It's not a good flop for us. We certainly can't expect to fold out any pairs. And I'm not sure how many worse unpaired hands our opponent has pre-flop, and is then going to choose to check call with. Certainly, I think we're looking mostly to ace queen and ace jack for hands which do that. And I'm not sure they're played this way pre-flop, and B, well, they may not check call the flop, although they probably will. But certainly the number of combos of hands like queens through tens, possibly nines we can expect to see. I would expect to make this unwise to bet. I have no idea what just happened there. I will check later and hope my computer's not going to be absolutely destroyed by then. Yeah, and on the top right, we just fold to a turn bet just because this range is so strong. We're effectively drawing to 3 outs, and that's not going to be one of the spots where we make our money against fish. Although in terms of reciprocal EV, it may be. Reciprocal EV being the EV both players would generate in similar situations. So a fish just isn't going to fold a gut shot there, whereas the fact that we can means that we're going to gain money relative to them in a long run. Ace-8 is a pretty loose peel, but we're guessing about 6-7 to 1 or something pre. So I think it's probably fine. Just going to quickly talk about this ace-queen hand in the small blind on the bottom left. This is normally a pretty standard 3-bet small blind against cut-off. The reason we don't this time is because our hand has very little nut-making potential and we're more than 200 big blinds deep. So it's not a hand that's going to play well in a bloated pot out of position this deep. And our opponent can really make our life hell on a ton of flops. So we probably want to be 3-betting a much tighter range out of position and developing calling ranges. Small blind against cut-off and button. Because 3-betting hands like this, and especially once you get to hands like King Jack off, you're just reaching a situation where they're going to start playing much better as a call. This also means that the argument in favour of never having a calling range in this situation, namely that your range is going to be very vulnerable to a squeeze, and also your range is also going to be very well defined. They apply somewhat less, considering our calling range is going to be slightly wider and slightly stronger against when we're 200 big blinds effective with the open razor, considering we're also going to start flatting ace king off in this situation, and probably pocket pairs up to about 10s here. So that's good. Obviously we're just going to bet the turn and hope to jam the river with ace king. Doesn't seem to be any other way to play it. And this king is just going to be a situation where I think it's going to be best to check your whole range on the turn because of the relative strength of ranges. The king's very good for his range and not too good for ours. And again, I think ace queen is strong enough to check call. It's the nut high card hand. His range is naturally pretty polarized because I don't think he's going to start betting the pair hands he checks back on the flop here. So he's not going to have hands like ace-5 or ace-3, and his value range is pretty much going to be, his value range is pretty much going to be King X and possibly some 2-pair King 5 suited if he opens that, or potentially whatever 6X he checks back the flop with. Yeah. We're definitely also going to want to have a check raising range there, considering we're checking our whole range on the turn. And obviously we river a queen, and considering this makes it super high in our range, I think there's no way to play this on the river but check call. Yeah, and this on the bottom right is a situation of a spot where we've been talking about earlier, where we would be betting against a known fish just because our equity is good. We can definitely get calls from a lot of worse hands, but against people who might be regs, I think he's 23-9 over 45 hands, so we're certainly not certain that he's a fish yet. Against people who might be regs, it's going to be better just to check and it protects our checking range, because there are going to be a lot of complete trash hands that we really don't want to start betting on this flop. So we're going to have all these weak hands in our check back range. So we need some. So we're going to want some strong hands that we can call turns and rivers with. So we're not just folding close to 100% of the time on the turn after checking back the flop here. Though certainly on this board, a calling range small blind against button is surprisingly strong. So if we assume that it's mostly middling pocket pairs and possibly some suited connectors and some suited broadways, then we have some stuff that's missed. There is king jack of spades, clubs and diamonds, possibly, and ace jack of the same. But pretty much everything is strong here. Pretty much everything else is strong here. So queen jack obviously has top pair, king queen top pair, queen 10 suited if he has a top pair, jack 10 straight, middling pocket pairs, either sets or gut shots, suited connectors, various hands between straights to a pair plus a gut shot to 2 pair. So he has very few strong hands and altogether quite a lot very few weak hands and altogether quite a lot of strong hands here. With that said, I still don't think we want to be folding the turn. Now we're tagging him as a fish because his turn sizing is just really weird. I think with this turn sizing, he's probably trying to accomplish something similar to a blocking bet. So he probably has a 9 or an 8 or something in that region, possibly a heart that he doesn't want to be raised off of, that he wants to set the price to see the river with, rather. And that certainly makes us feel a lot more comfortable with our hand. But certainly we don't want to be considering folding or raising here. And rivering a straight is obviously very nice. And I just don't think we can fold this river. If we're out of position where we're somewhat deep, I think we want to be making our 3 bets bigger relative to the open size, because we want to be discouraging calling a little bit more. Certainly when we 3 bets 3 big blind opens to 9 big blinds and we're 200 big blinds deep or whatever, there are actually very few there are actually very few hands that our opponent's going to want to fold. So this means that both we can make it bigger so as to get more money in with our value hands, and also we can make it bigger so we have some fold equity with our bluffs, which when you're a little bit deeper should probably be more playable hands, and represent something for quasi depolarized range. So you've got hands like suited connectors, possibly some suited broadways, rather than hands like, again, king jack off. I think is the classic example of a hand which you might sometimes want to 3 bet as a bluff. Well, not as bluff, as part of a depolarized range when you're not deep, because when you 3 bet 10 big blinds, 100 big blinds deep, you're going to see the flop with an SPR of 4.5, which is going to be pretty reasonable to play top pair making hands on. Whereas when you see the flop with an SPR of 9, you're going to be much less happy to check and then call multiple streets with a mere top pair weak kicker. Similarly, you're never going to make the nuts, so it's not going to be something that you can really value bet confidently across multiple streets, unless you hit 2 pair or trips, obviously. Against this $4 c-bet 3-way, I think we should just be folding, to be honest. His c-betting range should be pretty strong here, given the sufficient pot and given with 3-way. Um, I think possibly Ace-Jack with a heart is just within the hands which we should be defending according to the minimum defense frequency approach, which I'm going to do a video on soon. But just to quickly summarize, it's the idea that we don't want to allow our opponent to auto profit by betting any two cards. So we look at what percentage of our range we need to defend in order to achieve that. Given with three-way, our defense frequency is going to be lower because our opponent is going to be continuing some of the time. Rather, the middle position player is going to be continuing some of the time, which means that they're going to be shouldering some of the burden, so to speak. They're going to be reaching some of the defense frequency for of the two of us for themselves. But on the other hand, I think his c-betting range is likely going to be stronger here because the fish is probably not going to be folding that much of his range on this flop. So I think exploitatively we can just check fold here. And the turn is a very clear fold. Okay, so we've got a note on this guy that he has a tendency to needlessly bet showdown value hands. This certainly has strong implications for his range for betting the turn. We think he's probably going to be more likely to bet hands like a weak jack here, possibly ace high or a 6 or a 4. So it makes us much happier to call and either call a bet on the river or value bet if we're checks too. I think we could possibly go a bit bigger here, but I'm pretty happy with the way that one was played. Against the pot size 3-bet, we don't need to defend pocket 8s. So I think this is a spot in the top right where all three options are reasonable, though I'm not sure I really like folding that much. We can cold call if we want to develop a cold calling range, so we're probably going to be calling queens through 10s, ace queen suited, possibly ace king suited here, and mixing in some possibly cold calling aces some percentage of the time, so we're not completely unprotected when we do this. We can cold 4-bets, which is obviously a bluff. We're not really expecting to get much action from worse. Maybe sometimes king queen suited or something calls. King jack suited might also continue. It depends how our opponent plays against 4-bets. Or if you're really nitty, you can just fold, but I don't like folding. Folding, A, because folding is boring. I mean, who likes folding? Yeah. And B, because I think both of those options we should expect to see a positive EV from playing this hand. Really, it depends how you construct your ranges here. Though I think if you could structure your ranges in a way that this is a good hand to call 4-bets, you're probably... Okay, it's actually going to be an interesting spot. If you're probably going to be very vulnerable to 5-bet jams. Not that I really expect people to A, notice that and B, exploit you. But it is a good idea to have some general awareness of how your ranges are going to be exploitable, and also, again, I think the most important point is that it's just going to be super plus EV to call here, or rather, at least slightly plus EV. On the flop, I think our range is perceived as strong. When the small blind checks, I think, although some regs are certainly capable of checking over pairs here, I don't think That's going to be the case for the majority. Given the odds, he's guessing the cutoff is going to come along with quite a wide range. So I think, especially considering this is going to be very close to the bottom of our range here, this is a spot where it's very cool to start bluffing. We have decent equity against everything, and we should expect a high percentage of folds from both players. And in that spot, we're just assuming that the small blind is doing something with an overpair most of the time. It just doesn't really make sense to defend the bottom of our range in most cases, and I think the number of people who are going to bluff doing that are going to be substantially outweighed by the number of people who are going to do that with aces or kings. Pocket sixes on this flop can be either a best or a check. If we bet, it's probably a value bet. Certainly we're behind to a lot of his continuance range, but the fact that we're blind against blind means that it's much more likely that it's going to continue with hands like Queen, Ten of Spades. Certainly gut shots aren't folding, and a lot of ace high probably isn't folding. If we check, we're certainly going to have to call one bet, but the reason I think that that's not as good an option is that we're just very vulnerable to pretty much his entire betting range. So a hand like 9-8 suited here has 10 outs. Even a hand like Queen's Ten of Spades, let's just quickly put this in Equilab. Okay, so what do we have? We have pocket sixes, six of diamonds, six of spades. Against, let's go for Queen, Ten of Spades on a board. Jack of clubs, seven of hearts, two of spades. Yeah, even that has a very substantial amount of equity against this, considering there are going to be lots of turns on which it wants to barrel and which we're going to have to fold. I think it's going to have an R, that's a percentage of its equity that it realises, of greater than 100%. Having the initiative with an uncapped range certainly helps for that, and we're going to have an R of less than 100%. So in terms of the equity, we realise this is going to be much closer to 55-45 or even 50-50 in this situation. On the turn, I don't think we want to be double barreling this. The primary reason is that we never fold out a 7 or a jack, or a 7 or best of made hand, I should say. And we do start folding a lot of the hands that we could consider getting value from on a flop. Moreover, because there's only one card to come, our hand is much less vulnerable to his bluffs. Whether we check call or check fold, I think probably check call once is going to be better, but I'm not certain about that. 4D suited here, we can either check or bet. I expect realistically both options are going to have a fairly similar EV. But yeah, certainly once we've checked the flop, we don't want to start betting the turn. And on the river here, that's a really awful card for us. Notably, most of the gut shots made at least a pair. Hands like, again, Queen 10 suited, just rivered a pair. King Queen, it's probably still going to bluff, but we can't call now. Same for Queen 9, etc. So we expect our EV with this hand to go down close to 0 on this river card against anyone playing remotely competently. Yeah, and we just can't do anything with that. So this river is quite interesting. If, in case you guys didn't see, we raised under the gun, C bet the flop and got min raised. We called, turn goes check check. Now river, our hand has a value of 0. Has, well, obviously it chops a lot of the time, but it never wins it pot outright. The question is whether we should bluff, and I'm really not sure about that. The thing is, if we bluff, we have to bet big, because it's really hard to make fish fold chops, to make fish fold apparent chops. But on the other hand, I think it's also possible that fish decides to min raise a flop with the queen and then check back the turn, or possibly a 4. So betting big obviously exposes us to getting owned by the nuts or close to it, which is problematic. So I think either betting about $9 or just checking and hoping he checks back. Both are going to be reasonably sound options here. Certainly, I don't expect bluffing to yield an EV of much higher than half pots, if greater than half pots at all. Checking, I think, yields an EV of slightly less than half pots, because while we gain half pots if he checks back, certainly he's not going to check back a better hand here. A hand which beats the board. He is going to bet some of the time. Sometimes we're going to be behind and sometimes we're going to have to fold a chop. Yeah. So basically, it depends how much you assess how often he's going to fold a chop here, as to which option is better, and obviously how often he actually has a better hand. Yeah, I think ace queen on the bottom right. This is another example of a situation where against a fish we just want to be betting our equity. It's less clear here, but we can barrel pretty effectively. I think barreling on this board against a fish is going to be much better than barreling on the ace 10-9 board. Not just because his range is wider pre, because it's not a 3-bet pot, but also a lot of his calling range here on the flop is going to be pocket pair, is going to be under pairs to the 10, possibly backdoor flush draws, and also we turn significant amounts of equity on any diamond, any jack, any king, and we can continue value betting on an ace or a queen. I don't think we want to barrel this turn now, and I think when it checks through so quickly, we just want to get to showdown. If the small blind calls here, we're probably getting the odds to come along. If he doesn't, it's pretty close. Apparently I decided to call. I suppose getting 2-1, if we give him a decent amount of unpaired hands in his range, we've very rarely got less than about 40% equity against an unpaired hand. If he's paired, we probably have significantly less, so I think this is probably a fold, but evidently I felt like gambling. And I knew I was going to hit the flop, so yeah, good play, Joe. Yeah, so a reg flat small blind against under the gun, typically that indicates a very strong range. So I expect him to have hit this board pretty hard, but I also think that means that we want to start c-betting as a bluff with ace queen with a club, because we can barrel this hand pretty effectively. We expect to make him fold a decent amount of hands by turns and rivers. And also I expect him to mostly check raise with strong hands on this flop, so we can start betting big on turns and rivers when we're called, and expect to get a lot of folds, which is a very nice situation. Yeah, and particularly on this turn, I don't think he has Queen 9 or 9-7 pre. I think he raises all his strong hands on the flop, so I think this is going to be a good card on which to overbet the turn. Because it puts all of his range in a really tough spots. And I think I've explained why overbetting in theory yields a higher EV, even if your opponent is calling unexplosively against a capped range in previous videos, so I won't go over it again here. I think betting, just bombing the turn, is also fine. Here we're just calling the flop and turn because we're getting great odds to draw. No other reason. And I don't think that donking to bluff the river is going to get many folds from many made hands. So I think when we miss a river, we just have to accept that we lose the pass. Obviously, flopping set against the fish, very nice situation. And when we get donked into large, we're going to give him a strong range and raise to try and get lots of money in as soon as possible. Not sure what exactly he's donk folding there, but it doesn't really matter. Winning 5 big blinds on a flop is still a pretty good result. After the flop checks through on the bottom right, we could certainly consider betting this turn when we turn a gut shot. I think he's going to be leading with most flushes, probably most top pair hands. Though I think on a flushing card, most regs are going to be checking top pair more often than they would otherwise. I think the problem is, busting against big blind, we just have so many one spade hands which check back the flop and are much better to bet this turn here, and they don't have any showdown value whatsoever compared to ace 9. So here, our opponent isn't really representing many hands. So he's called middle position against under the gun, so I think we can immediately exclude pocket 3s and pocket 2s from his range, because he seems competent. He can have some overpairs, and he can have some draws and other bluffs. I think either calling or raising here are both fine options. For that reason, with our blocker to pocket 7s, the problem with calling, I suppose, is that we're just left in no man's land on so many rivers. But the problem with raising is that while we, because of the call is before us, we have more sets here than our opponents. If we check raise this hand, considering how wide our pre-flop range is, how many 7x we have, we're going to be struggling to control our bluffing frequency. With that said, I don't expect him to be I don't expect him to be particularly monitoring or thinking too much about our turn check raise bluffing frequency here. I'm not sure he's going to expect us to turn a 7 into a bluff. So yeah, as I said at first, I think both options of calling and raising are fine. On the bottom right, I hope we're going to fold. Our opponent could possibly be adopting a range checking strategy on this turn, and so have lots of flushes. And more importantly, we don't really rep anything that wants to raise against an overbet, because an 8 is just not going to want to raise here. We bet, at least by the turn, we bet all flushes and all 9-8s. And yeah, this deep, we probably want to raise to a size which makes it look like we can jam rivers. And when we get called, I think, especially on this river, we probably just have to follow through with our read and jam. Um, it's actually quite a tough situation. Certainly he can have pocket tens and the one combo of sevens. He can possibly have pocket queens here. Everything else, I think, is probably going to fold to a nearly 140 big blind bluff. Hmm. There are some flush draws on his range, so maybe check calling is an option. But I think a lot of the flush draws in his range here have river to queen, or are nut flush draws which might think they have showdown value against our checking range. So I think check calling isn't much of an option. Yeah, I think with our blocker, jamming is going to be the best option here. Expecting folds a decent amount of the time, but also sometimes to expect to get snaps by pocket tens or pocket sevens and to look like a complete idiot. Okay. Yeah. Like I said, some of his flush draws are going to river a queen, which is not great for us. And I think he probably has to fold that hand to a jam, especially considering he blocks a lot of our perceived turn bluffs. It's a spot where we can on the bottom right. It's a spot where we can consider firing multiple barrels against a fish, because we have decent equity. He's probably going to be peeling the flop very light, so probably with any ace of club hand. So we can expect a decent number of folds. And yeah, that's all I have to say on the points. And certainly when it checks to us on a river, we want to be betting to try and fold out either a 9 or some flush draw type hand. Although certainly we don't expect 9x to fold very often. Ace 9 seems a standard check call on the flop. And King 4 is a very clear bet on the turn. We don't have that many bluffs. We have a lot of hands who want to bet for value, and it has equity. Yeah, not much worth discussing going on at the moment. So I'll go back to being quiet. So you guys can have some peace. Do feel free to obviously to ask me any questions, especially about stuff that I haven't discussed. We certainly can't fold to the raise with 10-8 suited. It's a pretty strong hand here, and he's seemingly check raising a lot. Small sample, but that makes it the third time out of 12 opportunities, which is 25%. And I think the turn is a clear check. Not as I expect him to be going for a double check raise often, but we're not particularly vulnerable to any of his range, and with our draws, and our hand isn't quite strong enough to value bets, I don't think, given he polarizes his range on the flop. But yeah, definitely on the river we want to be betting. In theory, we want to be betting quite small, because we don't really have any bluffs that flows a flop check raise, then check back the turn. But I'm not sure to what extent he's capable of hand reading. So I think we can probably bet a bit bigger than we ought to in theory, just in case he has a7 and interprets a turn check back as weak. Against when a fish donks and a reg quickly calls, we probably assume, especially given the fish has chosen to bet a sizing this isn't pot, that the fish has quite a weak range. The reg probably also has quite a weak range, because with 2 pair plus that it is consider raising. And I think raising in that situation would be the best idea with strong hands to isolate the fish. So I think kings is probably going to be best as a raise here, probably to about 850. Yeah, 9's also fine. When the fish calls very quickly, I think we expect them to pretty rarely have nutted hands. And to have draws quite often. Clearly this turn isn't the greatest for us because 9-8 got there, but I still think it's one that we probably want to be value betting. Probably about $10, because stack sizes are actually really awkward here when both players call on a flop. I think a check would be much better if we had the king of clubs, the king of hearts rather. And when both checks are on the river, it's a very clear value bet. Probably, yeah, about $20 looks good. Not sure what the reg's calling there. Okay guys, I'm actually going to finish this video here. Thanks for watching. I hope it's been useful. Certainly it's had a slightly different focus, as mentioned at the start, to my previous video in this series. And good luck at the tables.